woozy and tired. Uh-huh. Yeah, I think I'm on the front end of a cold, and it's like I woke up with felt like razor blades. Oh. Joining me today on GHC Coffee Break will be Stephanie Wright, a faculty member at Georgia Highlands. We're going to be talking about human rights. Get your coffee and we'll be right back.
I'm transferring to the University of West Georgia.
Columbia University,
Kennesaw State,
UGA, Loyola University in Chicago,
Grambling State,
Shorter University.
I'm going to Greensboro College, and we all got our start at Georgia Highlands.
No matter where your educational journey takes you, you can get your start at Georgia Highlands College. Georgia Highlands College. Enroll, engage, excel.
Welcome to GHC Coffee Break. Joining me today is a friend and colleague at Georgia Highlands, Stephanie Wright, Dr. Stephanie Wright.
Yep.
She teaches psychology, and this is your second year.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, second year at Highlands, right?
Yes.
Yes. Also, second time, I think, on the
Right.
show. So today we're going to talk about human rights. And I thought we would just kind of get started in letting you define human rights, because people say, well, what does that really mean?
Right. So human rights, sort of very broadly, just means those rights that we are all understood to be born with just by virtue of the fact that we're human. And this is globally. So that's a really broad definition. And so there actually is a list of human rights that are granted to us under the Declaration of Human Rights that's given by the United Nations. It was adopted in the 1940s. And if you look really closely, there are two defining characteristics of this list of human rights from the United Nations. And the first of these is that it looks an awful lot like the United States Bill of Rights. And there are lots of things that are specific to the United States that are not included in the Declaration of Human Rights from the United Nations, but some of the more general pieces are. So, you know, that life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness piece is there, the right to own property, the right to a citizenship, the right to freedom of speech, those sorts of things. But then the other piece is that there are perhaps half of these rights that are crafted around the idea of sort of fair punishment and the right to counsel and the right to not be falsely imprisoned, falsely accused, and those sorts of things, particularly for citizens who are traveling abroad. So if I don't happen to be in my home country, then what happens to me if I'm accused of a crime? And so there are, you know, like I said, about half of these rights are simply given to us by virtue of being born human. And then about half of them are those that are given to us to sort of protect us if we happen to misstep or if we are falsely accused of a crime when we're traveling abroad.
Okay. That does help a little bit, because I know
Right.
a lot of people will, you know, what does it mean to have the right to, for instance, the one that hit me a minute ago when you were talking was the pursue happiness.
Right.
What does that really mean? And can you pursue happiness at the detriment to someone else?
And that's a great question. So in the United States, and generally in terms of the UN definition as well, what we tend to mean by the pursuit of happiness, so specifically to the United States, is that we can pursue whatever we wish to pursue, so long as we are not infringing upon the civil rights of somebody else. And as long as we're not doing that, then we are within the bounds of the law in terms of the United States. And so for the UN, it's pretty much the same thing, except they don't use those terms civil rights. So we look at universal human rights. And so as long as you're not infringing upon the universal human rights of somebody else, then you have the right to freely pursue those things that that give you pleasure.
Yeah, I just think it's one of those things that it's really interesting, because it is a matter of perspective.
Right.
Because something that makes me happy may not make you happy.
Right.
It may be indifferent or maybe even unhappy.
Exactly. Exactly.
But,
That as long as I'm not legally infringing, then I have the right to do it.
Okay, well, that's really interesting. I think a lot of people that'll be helpful to
Right.
to kind of, because that is something I think. I teach sociology at Georgia Highlands, and you teach
Right.
psychology. A lot of overlap, but also some differences
Mm-hmm.
too. And looking at the sociological definition of deviance, it's not the act itself, but the reaction to the act that defines deviance.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
so that to me is really big when you talk about human rights. When I go back and look at the Jane Pittmans, the other civil rights movements, the women, Singer, different women who said, I have the right to vote, and the things that they went through, we really, truly, those were deviant acts.
They were deviant acts because they violated the cultural norms of the time.
And if they hadn't have deviated, if Rosa Parks had not sat on that bus, had Margaret Sanger not done some of the things she did, and I believe she's the one. I may be getting her confused, but I think she's the one that worked with the abortion
She
rights.
is.
Okay. Sometimes I have so many people in my head that I forget everybody. Susan B. Anthony, but at the time, they were considered deviant because they deviated, as you said, from the cultural or social norms. It led to some positive outcomes and some change that needed to occur. But at that time, I mean, that was huge.
And Singer was actually exceptionally deviant.
Oh, yes.
She was engaged in a polyamorous relationship with both a lesbian partner and a heterosexual male who went on to create the character of Wonder Woman. Not sure if you're
I
aware
did
of
not
that.
realize that.
Yep.
Interesting.
Absolutely, she was. Yeah, read Jill Lepore's book. It's a fabulous book called The Secret History of Wonder Woman.
Okay.
Yeah, she's a historian from Harvard. It's a fabulous book.
Oh, I have to check that out. That sounds
Yeah.
interesting. But that's what I'm saying. The deviance of what people we call deviant has actually created some very positive social change and has, I think, reinforced the idea of human rights.
I think it has too, and it's interesting where you can track that progression over the last couple hundred years from where we first began to think about, what creates a human right, what actually is that, to the movements that have sustained the idea of human rights all the way through the present day.
What would you say some of the key things historically first, and then in our second segment we'll come back and kind of hit more present day. But historically, what are some things that really strike you as beneficial or helpful or just demonstrative of positive human rights?
I think probably the largest one has been the slavery movement. So the acknowledgement, principally here in the United States, but also globally, that it simply isn't within our purview, our moral purview, to own another human being. And so at the time we were doing that, we were legally justified in doing that, but were we morally justified in doing that? And so as those questions arose in certain segments of the population, the slave owning population, we began to kind of see that movement toward, there is something bigger than just our legal right. And that's where you really saw the birth of human rights, I believe. And that was probably our first big human rights movement, was the anti-slavery movement in the mid-1800s.
Yeah, and I always go back to also, and I get very frustrated, how we justified Native Americans on reservations.
Absolutely.
We're saying basic human right. Well, they were not afforded that. I mean,
Correct.
they were marched to these places.
Correct.
Trail of Tears in the southern area, the Cherokees and Creek especially, on these horrific, deadly death. I would call it a death march. And historically, we don't really like to, equate it to genocide, but it was.
No, we don't like to do that. And it was. And I think part of what we're able to do in whitewashing that is look at sort of marginalizing with cognitive dissonance our own, marginalizing our own indignities, the things that we did through, well, but there was this land granting, well, but there were these, these legal offsets, which we did not do with slavery. And so while both were terribly dark periods in our history, we treated them very differently. And because we treated them differently, I think it's easier to whitewash one than it is the other. Not that either was a lesser evil, just that it's easier to kind of step away from the one than it is the other.
And I guess with my research and stuff that I've done on the in Native American culture, especially in the Navajo, some of the things that I'm a little bit sensitive to, because I saw and I see them still on the reservation. Some of them, not all of them. In some reservations, they but there's a lot of reservations and a lot of areas on the reservation that poverty doesn't even begin to explain the definition. When you go to a house on the reservation where 6 people are living in it, it is not any bigger hardly than where you and I are sitting, maybe a 5x5 or a 6x6 shack with bunk beds, a wood burning stove, and that's it, and dirt floor. And that's very,
Right.
But that's not what, we don't talk about that.
No.
So, yeah, and it's still happening today. I was out there a couple years ago, and their bathroom is 50 to 100 yards outside of the house, and they have really cold and snowy winters. So,
Right.
There's still a lot of things that are not happening positive. And when we come back, that's one of the things we'll talk about. But I just, when I think about human rights, I think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Absolutely.
I think of that bottom level. We've got to have food and water. I mean, that is a basic need. Some people don't have that.
No.
Even today.
Right.
Even in the United States.
Right.
We try to think of, people in other countries.
Developing regions.
Developing countries. But it's still happening in America. Visit some areas in Appalachia. It's really scary that we have people in the United States whose basic need is food and water.
Right.
And then if you get into the next level of safety, our kids growing up and going to school nowadays, it's sad when you have to walk through a medical detector to go to class. And to me, when learning, if I am afraid for my life, I'm not going to learn a whole lot because I'm sitting here worried about who's behind me. So that is not a conducive to my human rights to have to worry all the time.
Right.
And how many shootings have we had in colleges even in this past year? It's scary. And then, of course, we're coming up on the anniversary of Sandy Hook.
Absolutely.
So kids, we're expecting them to learn and grow, but we're not providing them with a very basic human right of safety.
Right.
And you can't learn if you don't feel safe. I use it in class. I'll say to my students, I'll teach and I'll say, okay, well, all of a sudden someone comes into the classroom with a gun and they say, keep teaching, Dr. C. Y'all just don't pay attention to me. Well, I'm going to have a hard time just to keep teaching, and they're going to have a hard time to learn anything. But we are getting to that point that is what's happening.
Right. There are 2 or 3 states already that have passed concealed carry laws for college campuses. So
yeah, I mean, and there's been an argument, well, if they had a gun, would this have happened? If other people in the classroom would have had a gun, could they prevent it? And I don't have the answer. Bottom line, to me, guns don't kill people. People kill people. But that's just my own personal perspective. But I think it's just really interesting when we start breaking down human rights. There's a lot of things we just kind of take for granted.
there are.
So,
And there are conversations we don't have until we have to have them.
yeah. Oh, that's very, very true. And that's one of the reasons why I love doing this GHC coffee break. Yeah, I try to do things that are light, but I also want to cover the tougher issues.
Right.
So I really appreciate you coming to talk about human rights. We're going to kind of talk about some things. I've intermixed some past, present, but get your coffee and we'll be right back with Stephanie Wright.
Seven 7,000 high school students drop out every school day. That's a line of desks more than 4 miles long. We can keep students in school. Visit boostup.org and take the first step.
15 bills pending in the State House.
Welcome back to GHC Coffee Break. Joining me today is Dr. Stephanie Wright from Georgia Highlands College, one of our esteemed faculty member in psychology and a friend. Stephanie, I know there's so many things that we can hit on about human rights. I believe during break you just started telling me about 15.
There are currently 15 bills or resolutions, I think 4 or 5 are resolutions pending in the Georgia General Assembly, either in the House or in the Senate, that have something to do with human rights. And most of them relate either to the family with regard to domestic violence, or to campus sexual assault, or to rape and sexual assault in the community. Some of them have to do with children, with registering as sex offenders for sex trafficking, which is brand new. This concept that you would have to register as a sex offender for a crime that you actually didn't commit against the person. So
Say that again now?
All right, so if I am convicted of sex trafficking, so I haven't actually raped you, I haven't sexually assaulted you, but I have sold you for the purposes of sex trafficking and have been convicted of that offense, then I would have to register as a sex offender in the state of Georgia.
Oh, okay.
And so
Gotcha.
that's pending currently in the General Assembly. So we've got 15 bills right now pending in the Georgia General Assembly that are in some way or another related to human rights. And this is actually a goodly number for our state. And so, I think that it's really important for people to be aware of what's going on in their state level politics. A couple of these are simply affirmations of the United States and the United Kingdom or the United Nations and their own policies on human rights. And so these are good things that the state of Georgia would support these efforts. But most of them directly affect the citizens of the state of Georgia. So things like, we're going to appoint a special prosecutor if a law enforcement officer is accused of felony domestic violence, which we haven't done before. And so some of these are really good bills that are pending. They would have significant outcomes on the citizens. And so I think that it is important for us to know what's going on. It's not all placards and movements and charities. That some of it is actual work that's going on in our state, that just by virtue of the governor signing a bill that's been voted on and passed by both chambers of our General Assembly, that our lives change for the better, and that we reaffirm our commitment to universal human rights for the citizens of the state of Georgia.
I find it funny, not funny,
Right.
strange sometimes, that we seem to, we I don't want to say fix, we try to help something, but then 10, 15 years later, we're doing the same thing. It's almost like, you're smiling. What do you think? Okay, go ahead.
No, I just want to hear what you have to say.
Well, I think sometimes we think we've got an answer or solution, and you think things are getting better, but then 10 or 15 years later, a decade or two, we're just going to see the same stuff again.
I think that Well, I think part of that, and you'll know this as sociologists, part of it is just waiting on the data. I mean, sometimes we just can't know
Yeah.
for a little bit of time. And then I think sometimes we think we have the answer and we don't.
Yeah, but we just it seems like we revisit over and over again sometimes things that, to me, well, common sense almost, but then we have to put a law to it, and it's
Right.
like, really, I have the right not to be shot.
Right.
I don't know. It just, and my mind's kind of fuzzy right now because of this stupid cold, but it just really frustrates me that I guess I don't understand people not liking people.
Right.
Just to harm someone because they're black, they may be homosexual, or they may be whatever, a woman, or whatever, to put this kind of hatred and trash on them. I don't get that. My brain cannot wrap around how you could hate someone for simply the color of their skin or the sex. I don't wrap around it.
And I think that's why you do see the movements that you see. So things like the Human Rights Council and He for She and the National Network to End Domestic Violence, all the different movements that you see in organizations, NGOs, is because we have this Declaration of Human Rights given to us by the United Nations. At the same time, the Declaration covers all humans that are born globally, and yet we do see suppression of certain groups. We do see, active, active targeting with violence and trafficking and other human ills of certain groups. So even though the Declaration is meant to cover everyone equally, and that word "equal" is in the very first provision of the Declaration, as it is in our Constitution, we're not all treated equally.
Right.
And so even though it may confound you as a sociologist or me as a psychologist, while we live in the world, we know that that's not how people operate. And so that's where you get movements like these popping up. It's to say, okay, well, we have this oppressed group. So we're going to try and get this group elevated to the point of equality with the rest of the world.
Right.
And so it's kind of, it's almost like a game of reverse whack-a-mole.
Yeah.
So, let's
that's a good analogy.
let's get this group up. Okay, so now let's get this group up, and we got this group up, now this one's sinking again. So let's get this group up and this group up, and maybe eventually everybody will be kind of floating at roughly the same level.
Yeah, it just, like I said, it's one of those things, when I think of people, and I know that it's individualized hatred, but that our community can breed hatred. Kids are not born, come on, psychology. Kids are not born hating. They're socialized into hating and socialized into doing evil things upon someone else, or bad things. So from a sociologist, I
Right.
and you can definitely address this from a psychology perspective, but from a sociological perspective, to me, we teach our kids to hate and to do bad things to other groups of people.
Sure.
Yeah.
So we can teach them to do better things too.
Oh, absolutely. And, it just, to me, again, I'm trying to think of the basic human, the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Everybody has the right to reach their fullest potential, but what is their fullest potential?
Right.
For me, when I was in school, high school, middle school, college was not even on my radar. It's like, I'm going to get married and have kids. I'm 56. I don't care who knows it. I'm proud of every year. But when I was growing up, Mom did work out. She had a job. She didn't have a career. My mother's mother, which I found really interesting, and she's supposed to be looking for the article, but my mother's mother was like a Rosie Ribbit. You know, the one, she worked at Lockheed and she did
Right.
everything but fly the plane. And then they were expected to come back and pick up where they left off as mom, as wife. The League of Our Own is a great example of the the baseball, excuse me, not softball, baseball, women in baseball. You know, the things that have been taken back almost. Now it's getting better. We're back into that. You know, women can have careers
Sure.
and be mom and be wife. But to me, that's commonsensical. We shouldn't have had to, you know, say, oh, I have that right. That should just be assumed we have that right based on universal human rights.
I agree.
Okay, now, Stephanie, you got to give me a little bit more
No,
than that.
I agree 100%. I think that you said that beautifully.
It just, sometimes I can chat and just, I get on my soapbox.
No,
but
I think you're absolutely right. And that's part of, you know, this equation, part of this conversation is it shouldn't be, but, and again, as sociologists, you know this, the concept of privilege, there shouldn't, you know, strip away the concept of privilege and then it doesn't have to be, oh, she did that really well for a woman.
Oh,
You know, or
yes.
she, or, you know, he did that really well for a black guy, or, you know, whatever. There doesn't have to be any qualifiers. Just,
Right.
oh, hey, there's a great candidate for the job.
Exactly. And I think that sometimes we get in our own way.
We do.
I think we do that a lot, and I'm guilty as the next. Even as a sociologist, I try to wear my sociology glasses, but I'm human.
We're all human.
and they come off a lot because I grew up in an era where, like I said, women had jobs, they didn't have careers. The African American population were less than
Right.
I was. I remember having friends that were African Americans, and it was okay for me to have friends at school, but I couldn't bring someone home of a different
Right.
race. That prejudice and that anger just still, I look back and I love my father, but he even grew up before I did, and,
Right.
and even more critical things when it was black and white. But also women, you know, I don't want to just say it's a black and white issue.
It's not. It's, I mean, there are lots of women's issues, and we are all products of our time. And, you know, one of
Yes.
the things that we're trying so hard to do right now in terms of human rights is equalize educational opportunities for girls in developing regions. And it seems like such a no-brainer, you know, with every
Right.
year of education for girls, you know, you delay the age at which they get married, the age at which they become mothers, and you reduce their risk of domestic violence. And we're not talking about high school education. We're talking about primary grades education, and this is so critical. And yet one of the reasons that parents in developing regions keep their girls home is because, you know, we think about, you know, the elementary school down the street, and, you know, putting a kid on a school bus or putting a kid in the car and driving her to school. And yet in developing regions, there may be, you know, one school for 20 miles, and there are no roads, and people don't have cars. And so these, you know, these girls are walking miles to get to school, and they're frequently walking by themselves, and it's dangerous. And parents are saying, oh, it is safer to keep my child home than to send her to school. So they're making a short-term trade-off versus a long-term trade-off. And we want to say, no, don't do that. You got to send her anyway. And yet we're almost 580 days today. We're almost 580 days from the day that almost 300 girls were kidnapped by Boko Haram in their school.
Wow.
So these are parents that actually made the choice to send their girls to
And
school.
look what happened.
And they were kidnapped in school. And so, you know, it's like, talk about human rights. It's like, where do you go with that?
And I hate that we're having to wrap this segment up, but get your coffee and we'll be back with GHC Coffee Break.
The average text takes your eyes off the road for nearly 5 seconds.
All right, Stephanie, thank you for joining us on GHC Coffee Break. I did think of a book based on what you were telling me about the kids in the school. There's a great book called School for My Village. If you get a chance to read it, great book, talks about human rights in school and education in Africa.
Thank
so
you.
join us next time on GHC Coffee Break.